Welcome, everyone. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to you about the SQL migration tooling. And we also want to cover some best practices for the migration. I am Ajit. I am a program manager with Microsoft working on the data migration tooling.
Hi, everyone. I'm Neil. I'm a product manager as well, working on the migration space.
And with us, we have Des. He is architect manager with the SQL team. Today, we'll provide a quick overview of the modernization tools that we offer, and we'll talk a little bit in depth on what it means to get discovery, business case, and assessment in the Azure Migrate, using the Azure Migrate tooling. We'll also get into what the Azure Database Migration Service can do for you. And after that, Des will help us with talking through some of the complex migration patterns that we have, and after which we'll open up for any questions you may have. Right. Let's talk about the tools that you have. So we have the three Azure SQL targets, basically the Azure SQL database, the managed instance, and the SQL server running on an Azure virtual machine. If you are dealing with a lot of SQL servers that are running on various different platforms, virtualization using VMware, Hyper-V, or even physical machines, one of the easiest way to essentially go discover all the SQL instances that are out there and then perform the further steps would be to use Azure Migrate. With Azure Migrate, you would start by installing an appliance locally in your environment. This essentially ensures that all the heavy lifting in terms of talking to all the machines that are out there, connecting to all the SQL instances, all of that is happening locally in your network. So the appliance connects to the VMware host or the Hyper-V host or the physical machine, as the case may be, obtains metadata about the servers that are out there, and that metadata is then sent to Azure Migrate. If we discover SQL instances on the server, on the machine, we are able to connect to those SQL instances and pull metadata for the SQL instance as well. And with that metadata, we are able to generate a business case. We are able to create assessments against the Azure SQL targets. We'll get into details of what those look like further down from here. On the other hand, if you were dealing with small number of databases, maybe even just one, you can use the Azure Database Migration Service. If you have Azure, you get the Azure SQL Migration extension in the Azure Data Studio, which you can use to connect to the SQL instance and obtain the appropriate metadata for us to be able to do an assessment against the Azure SQL targets. Later, you can also use the same tool to migrate the database to Azure SQL. Now, what happens if you have more than one, as in enough number of databases that it's a little cumbersome for you to launch Azure Data Studio and do this repeatedly? Well, Azure Database Migration Service can help you there as well. You can use our database migration modules in the Azure PowerShell and CLI. Same procedure, you connect to Azure to your SQL Server instance, get the metadata required for your assessment and migration, right? So just wanted to, the reason for the big advantage here is that you can basically write scripts to perform this assessment and migration in a factory fashion, right? A migration factory fashion. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do with Azure Migrate. Azure Migrate allows you to discover your SQL instances. If you want to, you've got a lot of servers in your estate, your data estate. You need to go find out which ones have SQL Server. Azure Migrate is your friend. Once you have that, you can generate a business case, which basically helps you compare the total cost of ownership on premises and in Azure. With that, you can basically figure out what your projected savings are. In addition, it will also tell you what your savings could be with the use of Azure Hybrid Benefit and the ESUs, the extended security updates. Once you're done with the business case, you have a plan, you've figured out you're moving to Azure, you want to generate detailed SQL assessments to figure out what target is ideal for your SQL instance, and also to be able to determine what the cost of, so the eventual size of the Azure SQL target that you will use as a target for the SQL instance. For that, you will basically generate a SQL assessment. Let's look at what the experience looks like, right? So the journey starts with creating an Azure SQL, a project in the Azure Migrate, and you click on Discover to basically you get a guided experience here to basically figure out the servers that are running on premises. We have separate appliances that work for the VMware and Hyper-V virtualization. In addition, there's also a physical appliance. The physical appliance can be used if you're running on other public clouds or in private clouds, as long as you have network connectivity to Azure. Once you choose the type of virtualization, you get an experience where you can generate a project key, and you also have the option, you get an option to download the appliance either as a full image or with the installers. After you install the appliance, you basically provide credentials to allow the appliance to connect to the host. In this case, the example that you're seeing is basically a VMware example. So you can connect to the you can basically provide the credentials for the vCenter server and provide details of the vCenter server itself, so you can connect to it and start the discovery. To retrieve metadata from the SQL server and the servers, you can provide the credentials that, in most cases, you basically have certain credentials that work across your data estate. So you can use those credentials to basically to perform the discovery. Note that while this example kind of shows you an SA account, you don't really need the sysadmin permissions to perform the assessment. It's just an easy thing to use. Once the servers have been discovered, you can see that you get the details of all of the servers. You get what applications have been found on them and how many database instances were found on that. Click into that, you can actually even find out the versions, the current support state, and the number of databases that are within that particular SQL instance. After the discovery is done, you create a business case to do the planning. We talked about that. So look, the business case essentially gives you the TCO comparison. The on-premise cost is basically estimated using standard industry benchmarks. We also estimate the IaaS and PaaS cost and build you a year-on-year, cash flow change based on certain percentage migration that you do year-on-year. Also, as you can see, we have the savings that you can expect from the hybrid benefit and from the extended security updates. In addition, there are discovery insights which talk about servers in terms of how heavily they're used. You can see the OS distribution, how many SQL servers were found, and even how many web apps were found on that in your estate. Right? Let me see. All right. So next here, you can get more details of the actual TCO breakup between the on-premise and Azure by clicking on so the reports are basically split into three. You get the TCO breakup in one view. You also get the details of the IaaS servers the servers which are ready for IaaS, what the options there would be. Similarly for the PaaS offerings as well. Sorry. Once the business case is done, you can basically come in and create a SQL assessment. Under the assess, you have options of multiple. You have multiple options. Choose the Azure SQL assessment, and once the Azure SQL assessment completes, you basically get to see recommendations. You can see that of the 218 instances that were found, we see that about 68 were recommended for SQL Server virtual machines, 133 for MI, and about 17 for Azure SQL Database. There are also details of you can click through into the SQL Server instance readiness to see readiness by individual instance. We provide you the readiness for each of the targets, MI, VM, and DB. Also, just give it a moment. You also get the recommended target. In this case, you can see that each of them has a separate recommended target. And also, you can see recommended configuration for each of those. It's a column on the right that we'll get to shortly. Also, if there are any, in addition, there is the suggested migration tool for each of these. You will see that at this point, it's recommending Azure Data Studio. As I mentioned, you can also use the PowerShell and CLI. Clicking on the readiness option, the readiness value, you can basically get details of if there are any issues or blockers, you can get details of that from right there. Just waiting for this to. If you want full details of the assessment, you basically click on the instance itself and excuse a moment. So you have individual reports for the MI, VM, and DB. You get the target recommendations. Down below, you can see the instance properties that were discovered. Clicking on migration guidance, you get details of how you can migrate your SQL instance. And also, we have details of how the recommendation was arrived at, how it was computed, how the target deployment type was determined, and how we determined whether it was ready or not. Right. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague for discussion around the Azure Database Migration Service. Just give me a moment here. What just happened?
Yeah, thank you, Ajay. So I'm going to talk about Azure Database Migration Service. So just a quick raise of hand. How many have used DMS? Let's see, one, two. How many have heard about DMS, Database Migration Service? Okay, so we have people who have heard more but haven't used it. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to today talk about the capabilities of DMS, why we have introduced this service, what is the benefit of this database migration service. We'll demonstrate some of the capabilities, and finally, we'll double click on the architecture, what happens behind the scenes when you create a DMS service. So Azure Database Migration Service, the whole idea behind that is when we talk about migration, we always think, okay, we have a source, we have a target, and just move the data, right? But that's actually one part of it, right? If you want to kind of have a successful migration with a high confidence, there are various other elements or the steps you need to do. The first thing is assessment, right? You need to assess your source, and you need to understand whether is that compatible with your target. So broadly, we have 3 targets in SQL, right? So SQL database, SQL MI or managed instance, and SQL running on a VM, right? So what we add in this assessment is to highlight any of the blockers or any of the issues which you might encounter after you do a migrate to that platform, right? So assessment is your starting point when you kind of start the source to destination journey. Now, along with the assessment, the next is the sizing, right? Sizing is complex because suppose you have an on-premise machine, right? And you kind of have over-provisioned. Do you want to maintain the same over-provisioned hardware in Azure? No, not really, right? You want to right-size it, and you don't want to undersize or oversize, right? If you oversize, that means you are going to bleeding money, and if you undersize, that means you are going to kind of hurt the performance. So we do this queue recommendation, and we do this queue recommendation identify, okay, if you are going to select Azure SQL Database as a target, is general purpose is going to be suitable, or business critical, or hyperscale? And out of that, what is the exact size? Is it a 2 vCPU, 4, 8, 16, and so on, right? So the next step is the SKU recommendation, which is very important, because once you understand the recommended SKU, you go ahead and create the target of that size. And then is the data migration. Now, data migration, there are broadly 2 types we categorize, is the online and offline. Just to kind of give you an idea, the offline is point-in-time snapshot. You export the data in one time from the source to target, right? Whereas the online method is you're kind of maintaining a catch-up between the source and target, so you're trying to minimize the downtime, right? So while offline is easy because you just have to one time do the migration, but it has a longer downtime. So if you have a kind of a RPO, RTO, sensitive RTO, RPO, then offline might not be the right way. So that's where the online migration comes into picture. So when you look at this diagram, you see that there are two major components here. The database migration tools, which can be your CLI, which can be in Azure Data Studio, as well as Azure Portal. So the benefit of DMS, one more, is all these capabilities kind of you can interoperate, right? So that's the benefit of the Azure DMS tools. And in order to kind of migrate the data or migrate the backup and restore from your on-premise to Azure, there has to be a line of sight, and that's where the migration agent you need to install. Now, the migration agent you can install on-premise or on Azure on a VM, provided it has a network connectivity and you have the right firewalls ports opened. Now, this migration agent internally installs an integration runtime, which helps you to move the data. And I'll double click a little bit more when I'm talking about the design and architecture. Now, another key benefit of going to the DMS is, while I talked about the assessment, recommendation, online, offline, is the orchestration, right? So when you are starting a migration, and especially like when you're doing a logical migration, right? Because backup restore will not work for an on-premise to a SQL DB. So there has to be pre-migration, like, hey, disabling the foreign keys, disabling the triggers, migrating the data and enabling it. So the entire workflow, the orchestration, is taken care by DMS, right? And it also gives you an ability to monitor in the Azure portal as well as in the Azure Data Studio. So you can do a real-time kind of monitoring how your data movement or the backup restore progresses. And the finally is the DMS. All this data movement, it's a kind of free service from us. So any kind of data movement which you do, there is no associated compute cost of the DMS for the data movement, which you need to factor in your kind of costing, as well as the when you're trying to calculate the APEX and the OPEX for the migration. So we support majorly all the three targets: Azure SQL Database, MI, and VM. And the source can be an on-premise, it can be on a private cloud, it can be an AWS RDS SQL Server as well as SQL Server running in another public cloud, right? So we pretty much kind of cover pretty much the length and breadth of any of the SQL estate available today. However, the only difference is the Azure SQL Database, as a target, we only support offline. We don't support online data movement at this point. While MI and the VM, this feature has been there for quite some time, but the database is something which we have recently introduced. So in my demo, I'm going to talk about how SQL database migration you can do using the DMS. Now, to do the migration for the MI and VM scenario, you need a staging environment where you will have the backup files and we are going to restore the backup files. So we support both the options. So you can either choose Azure Blob Storage, and when you select Azure Blob Storage, you really don't need the migration agent gateway, because it has the direct connectivity to the, the cloud blob storage, and from there you will be able to restore the target. But if you're using SMB network file share, where you are going to store locally and that needs to be copied, and then that's to be or that needs to be restored, then you need to have the migration agent installing the integration runtime to do the migration data movement. So I'll do a quick demo, and in the demo, as I said, DMS exists in Portal, CLI, and ADS. So I'll take two experiences. One is of the the Azure CLI, and another of the Portal, right? So this is the a PowerShell, the AZ CLI. So we have AZ data migration, and the command lines are get assessment. So that is where it will go ahead and perform the assessment, right? So first, I need to authenticate. So let me go ahead and run the selection. Okay. Hold on. Yeah. So I do my Azure, the Entra ID authentication here. That's done. So it will go ahead and check against the each and every tenant. And once it does for the each and every tenant for the subscription, it kind of authenticates and says, yes, you have trusted access on those data stores. Then I start the get assessment. To do a performance assessment, you need to provide the connection string to the source. So in this case, I am running this on my laptop, which has the laptop name. And then I have the initial catalog, which is master database, and I'm going to use the Active Directory authentication, so integrated security true. And the output of that, I'm going to store in a JSON file, right? So let me go ahead and run the assessment. So if you observe right now, I have not taken any of your target information. So assessment is very agnostic. At this time, we are not connecting to the target. We connect to the source and kind of do the feasibility study of your migration, right? So this takes around 1.5 to 2 minutes. That's what I kind of tested in my environment. So I'll just quickly show you in the meantime, 1 second. So this JSON, okay. Yeah, just a second. So in this JSON, you will have, once the kind of the assessment completes, it gives you a very high level kind of what are the issues which is identified and how many databases it can migrate to the target, in this case SQL DB, MI, or VM, and what are the kind of potential kind of causes or concerns, right? So here you say, hey, you need to create a database scope credentials, Azure SQL suppose database, but convert the server scope credentials to the database, right? So along with that, it gives you a readiness, right? And this readiness, it says, hey, what are the easily which can be converted or migrated to the target. So here the target, I have the Azure SQL database, right? But it only says that only 4 of them is kind of ready for migration out of 6. So if you look at here, only 4 are number ready for migration out of total number is 6. That means 2 are not ready. In this case, is sysdb and so on. Whereas in case of my managed instance, if you look at, it has all the 6 databases. That means it's not using any function, the server, it's not using any functionality which is not there in SQL MI, right? So that's the first pass, and the output of this, you can consume. If you want to further automate it, you can go ahead and consume it, right? And it's a long list. It kind of keeps on talking about the, hey, what are the object-related, hey, 3-part queries are not supported. It has to be two parts, so cross-database queries are not supported, and so on. So it gives a pretty detailed output using the JSON, right? But if you want a GUI experience, you can go ahead and do it in Azure Data Studio as well. Now, once the assessment is complete, right? So if you look at here, I just showed you the output right now. It's kind of in progress. Now, once the assessment is complete, the next is the SKU sizing, right? For the SKU sizing, right now in the SQL, there is no real-time matrix which kind of is available for end user. So what we do is we run this commandlet again, performance data collection, and we provide the same connection string. Now, when we look at it, there are a few interesting parameters. Perf query interval, that means we are going to poll and run the performance data collector every 10 seconds, right? And it will be iterate for 5 times. And once I've collected this data after 5 iterations, I'm going to aggregate it. I'm going to store the average, the standard deviations, and so on. And then I'm going to write it to and persist in a file system, right? So every 10 seconds, we pull the data, poll the data, but we don't write. We kind of cache it, and for the 5 iterations in this case. And once the 5 iterations is done, we kind of aggregate the data and insert 1 row in the file system. And when we are doing the sizing, there is performance data, and then there is configuration data. right? Hey, how many CPUs you have, what is your max server memory, and so on. So that information we pull every 120 seconds. Now, if you want to kind of time bound it, you have another property called hyphen hyphen time, and you can go ahead and time bound that. Otherwise, if you don't specify that parameter, that means you have to manually stop it, right? So I'll quickly go ahead and start this. And you would see that it goes in a loop, right? It will say that, hey, iteration 1, iteration 2, iteration 3, and so on, right? So how many data points it has collected. So we collect primarily the CPU information, the memory information, the IOPS information, but underneath those also, there are multiple subparameters or metrics we collect. But broadly, we collect kind of 20 to 25 or no, 20 to 30 based on the source and the target scenario. So if you look at after 3, it'll go on 5, then it will start aggregation, and then it will write to the storage file in this case. Just give me 1 minute. 4 or 5, 5 or 5. Yes. So you see, it aggregated because 20 to 500 data points, and it's into 19 performance counters, and then it's saved to the output, right? So, and the reason we do it is we don't want to kind of make the system so busy, and also we know that we do the average of average. So we kind of collect the data, do the aggregation, and then write it so the output file is also kind of in a decent size. It's not a huge bloated file, right? So while this continues, I'll quickly show you that we go ahead and create 3 CSV files here. And if you look at is the customer DB level, common instance, and performance matrix aggregated data. So all the performance aggregated data we write in the CSV file, right? And then once you are done with your kind of aggregation, so this will continue till I stop. So let me cancel it. It might take some more time to kind of completely terminate the out of proc call. So I have another window. So once you have the output, what you do is you can do this queue recommendation, right? And I just simply pass get queue recommendation, right? And in this case, suppose for an example, as I said, I'm more interested in the Azure SQL database. So what should be the Azure SQL database recommendation, right? So I'll go ahead and I can pass the SQL MI, SQL VM, or any as a kind of option, right? The value can be any of these. So let me go ahead and run this. So what it does is the output CSVs, which it has generated, right? It takes that as an input. It will actually run an algorithm, and once we run that algorithm, it finds which are the SKUs supports that matrix, like your CPU boundaries, your memory boundaries, your IOPS limits, which is the SKU which will support that, and then we see which is the most cost effective in that list, right? So for an example, right, as it just did finish the assessment, so I'll quickly run this HTML report. So this has been a pretty light system at this point. So it gives me, hey, these are the databases, general purpose, 2 core, storage sizing, and then, for example, these are the kind of the recommendation here. IOPS is database size, your database log size, and so on, right? And then it says the requirements and say, hey, what are CPU, memory, storage, IOPS, and latency? These are the parameters we did evaluate, right? So that's the SKU recommendation. And once you identify the SKU, then you can go ahead and create the target of this size, right? And then you are sure that, yes, you have a target which is kind of as close as your actual usage of your server. It's not like, hey, you might have a 32-core machine, but you are not using the CPU more than 20 or 30%, right? So you are sizing the Azure target appropriately. So I'm done this. I've completed my assessment. I have completed my SKU recommendation. The last step is to do the migration, right? So for the migration, I'll switch to the portal, right? So I already have a DMS service created, right? So I click on New Migration Service. So I have to select the source and the target. So I'm going to select Azure SQL Database, And as I said, right now we support the offline. This is the newest edition. So MI and VM we have already kind of supported. So SQL database. Now, in case of SQL database migration, we do logical data movement, right? That means you create the schema and then you move the data, right? So I'll just quickly, so this is the database I'm going to move. So here I have some of the airline related tables. Uh, 1 second. So I have airline, airplane, airport, flights, and so on. And in the target, I have a SQL bits demo. This is going to be my target database. And the tables, it doesn't have any of these tables, right? Yeah. So I, so as I said, for the online migration, as well as when you are trying to migrate the database using the file share in case of MI and VM, you need an integration runtime and the database migration agent. So it does a pre-validation. Now, in my case, I've already kind of installed the integration runtime, and I'm using my laptop. So if you look at my laptop, I have the SQL bits demo, right? So if you look at, this is the DMS service name here. That's exactly the data factory name which I've used. And I have made my laptop as the integration runtime, right? So that prerequisite, so we have done a single click experience to install. We have simplified that, but you need to go ahead and install that agent. Once you install the agent, then you have to provide the source information, right? So I'm going to use my database, which is running on my laptop. Yeah. And then I said select database. So all this connectivity from this portal all the way to the source and all the way to target, it always go through the migration agent where we have this runtime installed, right? So and it needs the right ports to be opened between the migration agent runtime as well as the source and the target. So it takes few seconds to kind of authenticate it. Yeah. So we'll just wait. Yeah. Now I'm going to select this aviation database. It's around 7.89 GB, so decent size. Then I'm going to select the target. So I already have the SQL database created. So I'm going to use the SQL authentication. I'm going to provide the password and map the source in the target database. So what we have to do in the map source and target is we see the source database, and you have to choose the right database on the target, and then the data migration will happen from the source database to the target database. So again, this authentication, it goes through the integration runtime, and then it goes ahead and does the authentication. It's going to take another 10, 15 seconds. And then I choose this database. Then I have to select the tables. Now, when I select the tables, because there's no tables on the target, no schemas on the target, this was one of the kind of commonly requested feature. Hey, can you also include the schema migration along with the data migration? So this is one of the newest additions. So when you go to the next screen, you will see that we also migrate the schemas and then migrate the data. Previously, we were just migrating the data, so you had to take care of the schema migration, but now that is also taken care of. So again, it's going to take a couple of seconds. Yeah. And then, as I said, I have the migration public preview, database migration summary. It gives all this information, and you click Start Migration. Now, this start migration is going to take 7 minutes. So maybe once desk covers and it comes back, the migration should succeed. And if you click here, sorry, not this one, this one. It shows the different stages. Hey, how have I converted the schema? How much is this? Which stage of the migration we are, right? So schema, the script deployment, and so on. So while this migration is going on, I'll just take one more slide and then I'll hand over to Des. Is what happens behind the scenes? So just to kind of give you an understanding, because we have installed the migration agent, which had an integration runtime. Why do we need that, and so on? So if you look at on the right-hand side of mine, we have a client tools, which does the assessment as SQL recommendation. It's a common module. As you said, it didn't require the target requirement destination. And then we have any of these activities is broken down into control plane and data plane. The control plane helps in the orchestration, the monitoring, the creating the workflows, and so on. So, and this right now the migration is going on, right? This whole migration, the row which you have seen, we maintain like it's at the schema migration stage. It is at the code convert. Data migration stage. So all this information is stored in the control plane. And the actual data movement happens through the integration runtime here, as you see, and which requires a data factory. So behind the scene, we create a data factory which does the most of the plumbing and the data movement. And if your data is in if your source is on-premise and target is on Azure, and if there's no direct line of sight, then that's where the integration runtimes comes. It allows you, and if you see, it allows you to move the data from your source to target of your choice, right? So that's the high-level DMS architecture. And as I said, ADF is a PaaS service again behind the scenes, so it's reliable, scalable. You can have multiple integration runtimes and migration agents to kind of do the movement. So with this, Des, why don't you join? While I cover just the new enhancements, we are, as I demonstrated, new schema migration, portal experience of DMS is GA. We support login migration for endpoint and premium SSD v2. That's also one of the most requested feature. Over to you, Des.
Thank you. Here. So thanks very much. I am here to discuss a little bit more about some of the areas that are more complex in terms of migrations. So our team within the product engineering group, we work a lot with customers that are going through these kind of complex data migrations from both heterogeneous as well as SQL sources. And by working with these customers and looking at the complexities of these migrations, we also build up some assets and IPs from our engineering team's perspective to close some of the gaps that exist or existed in the past. As you heard from Neil, the latest database migration service allowing you to move to SQL DB is one of the areas that in the past wasn't possible. And this is an area that we built up a piece of IP that I'll talk about in a little bit about. And I'll show an actual demo of it. And I'll explain exactly still today where it could be beneficial. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on each one of these. I think maybe they'll be very familiar to many here in the audience. What we generally see are areas of concern for customers around like very low downtime migration requirements. So for tier 1 critical applications that are moving from both SQL over to Azure SQL, and the flavors were mentioned before by both Ajit and Neil, as well as from, as I mentioned, heterogeneous sources like Oracle, DB2, and the like. There's very much a requirement to keep the downtime to an absolute minimum. We also have scenarios where there's extremely high data volumes. So you need to do parallelization of data movement, if that's a logical data movement, like was being described right now and is being ran in the background as we're seeing for the logical migration of the data from SQL to Azure SQL. One of the areas there within DMS, for example, you all saw the IOR, the integration runtime, that is the work engine behind running this from ADF perspective. That can also be scaled to a certain extent. But what we've also seen is that there's other ways to also make sure that we're focused on getting the most data volume through in the shortest amount of time. And I want to just bring one other point, which is the bottom point, which is the post-optimization that needs to be done. So this isn't so vitally important in many circumstances where you're going from SQL to SQL, but certainly if you're coming from non-SQL to Azure SQL, this is an area that needs high levels of concentration. So we talked on Thursday here about modernization of mainframe and Oracle workloads. Today I'm going to be focusing though on DHL, just very quickly as a use case, and I'm going to race through this and discuss a complex migration of a scenario where we had both a very low downtime requirement as well as a very high data volume. So about 20 or actually 22 terabytes of data that needed to be moved from DHL's main system of tracking, parcel tracking, which is something that we worked on recently with them. And we have a public case study, so nothing I'm saying here is not allowed to be discussed. The customer knows I'm here and knows I'm discussing about this. So in this scenario, it's a classic example of somewhere where we would love to use our tooling, but unfortunately, the scope and the area that we needed to focus on here limited our ability to be able to use our first-party tooling. Again, that's our preference in all migrations, and our tooling is stellar. But in certain circumstances, we have to find workarounds and other alternatives for this. In this case, we had to use a combination of shipping database backup, striped database backup to multiple devices with Databox, and in parallel, ship across transaction logs while that transit was happening, restore everything into a virtual machine, and at the virtual machine level within Azure, then take the data across. In this case, we decided to use a program called Smart Bulk Copy. I don't know if anyone is aware of that program. It's again created by one of the members of our team and improved on by the community. We would probably today be in a better scenario to use some of the tooling that was being mentioned by Neil, ADS, for example, to move to Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. In this case, that wasn't available at that time, as was mentioned earlier. That's a pretty new functionality. So in the time that this was ran about a year and a half ago, we were having to use Smart Bulk Copy for that. We were able to do this migration with a downtime to the customer of around 24 minutes, well, not around exactly, 24 minutes. And it was a highly successful migration. Their current architecture that they're using right now in Azure gives them the ability to be able to do very high scale in terms of their read activity. As you can imagine, if you're shipping anything and you want to check the status of your package, this is the system you're using with DHL. So in specific periods of the year where there's heavier load, around holiday season or Black Week, for example, they're able to scale using the very robust architecture that we have in Azure SQL Database Hyperscale in terms of named replica scale out. They're able to scale their read workloads immensely and very quickly and efficiently using the new architecture. I wanted really quickly to touch on the piece of IP that I mentioned earlier that our team has built around migration of data using basically Spark. So in those scenarios where you might like to have online migration of your data from SQL to SQL DB, today there's a number of third-party tools that can be used to do that. As was mentioned before, it's something that we're working on, but currently today that's not a possibility in DMS. So as part of this session, I wanted to just quickly touch on the Spark-based IP that we have created to close that gap. That IP can be basically used in order, you can contact us after this session if you're interested in this, to migrate and move Oracle or SQL to Azure SQL. And it can be used at scale and very efficiently to move very large quantities of data with a very low downtime in order for you to overcome those kind of scenarios that you might have. We also support CDC in that. So for the online portion, that's an important aspect. So not only the initial data movement as such, but also continuous and ongoing CDC. We also support through a CDC engine. So very quickly, I'll run through the demo. So in the demo, what we're basically seeing is an example of this moving Oracle to SQL, to Azure SQL. Actually here to SQL Server, so we're just showing it's our Oracle database, and we're basically taking a 50 million row table and we're moving it over into Azure, into SQL Server in this case, but again, as I mentioned, can be also Azure SQL. So just showing that it's 50 million rows, then showing also there's no kind of nothing dodgy happening here, that there's actually nothing in the SQL Server side in terms of rows. And then we're going to have a look at how this magic happens basically by going into the compute. This is the Spark cluster. We can use either Databricks in this case or Fabric Spark pools to run this. And in essence, what this will also do is it'll allow us to scale up and down the Spark cluster as we require it, and it'll actually auto-scale the cluster for us based on the amount of data it has to move. We just have to import the correct libraries for connectivity, and then basically go ahead and go to our notebook, have a look at our notebook, and then make the connection from basically source to target. And then we have the logic built into the notebook that basically uses auto-partitioning of the source. It does this whether it's, again, doesn't matter if this is an Oracle source or a SQL source. In this case, it's Oracle, but it can easily be SQL. And there's the CDC portion of this underneath as well, which we don't actually show in this demo. But as I mentioned before, we do support kind of continuous data migration post-initial load using this tool as well. So here we're just making sure that the driver is all connected. We're also telling it to just move, as Neil also showed, where you can select individual tables. What we're doing here is selecting a single table, our big table that we showed earlier of employees. And we're going to be moving that across. Here you can also select individual columns if you so wish. So if there's a specific need to just migrate portions of a table or the like, you can do that with this IP as well. And now we're going to just start the load, but also in the interest of time, I'm going to just pause it here because if you want to see it, you can watch the catch-up on Thursday's session. I promise it copies everything. The point is people often ask us, how long does this take? Like, what are our metrics? Because here I'm showing a 50 million row table, right? But I'm not showing you, basically I showed you just how many columns are in there, but I'm not showing you the makeup of that table. So more relevant is like throughput, right? And what we've been basically able to do is for initial data loads, we look at about every 3 hours, we get about 1 terabyte of data movement from an on-premises environment into Azure. Again, your mileage may vary based on what connectivity you have between your on-premises environment and Azure. So, you know, express route and what bandwidth it has. But that's the kind of thing that we have. So I want to just very quickly also shut this. Oh, that's on the other side. I want to also just make everyone aware of our main website. So on basically aka.ms/database migration, you can see all of our guides, the latest guides that we have around a multitude of different source to target pairings. With that, I'll hand over.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Pretty much there.
Survey, yeah. Yeah, we're just looking for feedback. So we keep improving our product, right? So as you said, seeing the Azure SQL DB as a target, that's something which we picked up. The schema migration, that's something which we heard from the customers and the field as well as community. So please provide the feedback. This is a QR code if you can scan. It's a Microsoft form. You can quickly fill up, provide some of your pain points, what's working well, what's not. And these are our coordinates. So Ajit, Neil, Des, so you can reach out. If you have any specific migration pain points, please reach out to us. That's it for today, and have a good weekend. But any questions? Anyone has any questions? Yes?
There's one question from the online auditorium. Are the recommendations provided for DTU model or only vCore?
So right now it's the vCore model,
Only
right?
vCore,
Yeah, only the vCore, and yeah.
At this point, it's only
vCore, yes. Any other questions?
Anybody has anything?
We will be here somewhere near the booth for some more time. So if you want to kind of catch up, have a quick coffee chat, more than happy to do so. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
and,
you, everyone.
yeah.
It's been a lovely audience.